Hey everybody, welcome to another off-the-shelf board game review. This week we're going to be looking at Mars Attacks, a miniatures game from Mantic Games. Game does list as a two-player miniatures game, but it is one of those games that you can definitely play with more than two players quite easily without needing any modifications. And actually cover that when I go over the full review. Anyways, Mars Attacks is based on the property from Topps trading cards from the 1960s, not on the terrible movie. And trust me when I say if you haven't seen the movie, you're really not missing anything at all. Anyways, Mars Attacks is based on planet Earth being attacked by Martians, and the reason why they're attacking us because they've pretty much ruined their own planet. If they don't find a new place to inhabit pretty darn quick, their whole race is going to be wiped out. So what they've decided to do is they've decided that they're going to send all their forces to planet Earth, attack planet Earth, and try to take it over. This is a scenario-based game, so at the beginning of the game, one player is going to decide if they want to be the human defenders or if they're going to be the Martian attackers. Players are going to decide what scenario they want to play. They're going to set up the game board with all these destroyed buildings. They represent basically what's left of the city that's being attacked by these horrible Martians. And everything's going to be resolved by the roll of the dice or by players playing cards to make each other's lives more difficult. What sets Mars Attacks apart from other games that allow you to have miniatures on a battlefield and start attacking each other is this modular terrain that allows you to build these battlefields any way you like. The inclusion of heroes, which are going to help out both sides of the battlefield because they bring extra special powers to the battlefield that can sometimes break the rules in one player's favor. And finally, if you buy expansions, you can create some absolutely gigantic battlefields with many, many figures on both teams attacking each other and trying to obliterate the other player. If you want to watch Mars Attacks played, click the link on the screen, assuming that YouTube isn't giving me any fits. If you want to see my final thoughts, click the other link. Or if you want to learn how to play Mars Attacks, stay tuned. Mars Attacks is actually a pretty easy game to teach other people how to play. It's just a couple dice rolls, a couple card plays, and the player's just going to switch back and forth taking turns until one of the victory conditions has been met. The victory conditions are generally based on the scenario you're picking, and we're going to go ahead and show you how to play the game using the very first scenario in the basic rulebook called The Invaders Arrive. It's a really quick scenario, and basically each player is trying to be the first one to get 8 victory points. Whoever does wins the game. This scenario pits 5 Martians against 8 human military soldiers, and it may seem lopsided at first, but you have to understand the Martians have extra special abilities, making them really hard to defeat. But I'm getting ahead of myself before we go anywhere. I need to explain to you some basics of how to play Mars Attacks. Every single figure in Mars Attacks has a couple really simplistic statistics that they have to rely on to see if they're going to be able to shoot, fight, survive, or just if they hit a target that they're trying to shoot. Basically the way it is you're going to have a shoot statistic, and you need to roll that or higher on a die to get a success. You're going to have a fight statistic, and that's basically if 2 guys happen to get in the same square and they decide to go to blows because, when you got a Martian in a scare, there's nothing more fun than just to start trying to beat them down. And then finally, there's a survive statistic, which you have to make rolls to see if you can live when you're shot by a disintegrating ray, shot by a machine gun, or somebody decides just to beat you over the head with a big stick. Finally, there's also range, and I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but you should be able to, but this entire board is breaking down into an 8x8 square pattern. And each one of these squares is what you're going to use to count your movement and what you're also going to use to count your range. So for example, this military man who happens to have a light machine gun. And of course, after I say that, I'm going to realize this is actually somebody who has a carbine. So I'm going to pick somebody who has a light machine gun. He has a range of 1 to 12 squares. So as long as his line of sight isn't blocked, and I'll cover line of sight in just a minute, he can hit anything that's up to 12 squares away. So if he's in this square, he wants to hit one of these Martians over here. Simply counts 1, 2, 3, 4 squares. You can see that they're perfectly within range as long as he has a line of sight. Whereas this guy with a carbine, he can only hit up to 6 squares away, so his range is 1 to 6. So if he just happened to be all the way over here, he can count the squares and see that he could hit this Martian right here. But we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can hit here, and we can actually all the way hit over here just by counting the squares, as long as we have proper line of sight. Now the way things are going to work basically is anytime you want to roll for a success, you're going to roll 3 dice, and you're looking for a minimum result on each one of the dice, and each time one of these dice rolls that number or higher is considered a success. And also, like a lot of Mantic games, this game uses exploding dice. Now what an exploding dice means is anytime you roll an 8, which is the highest you can roll on an 8-sided die, this die is considered a success, and you're allowed to roll an extra die for free, and you're going to add that to whatever you roll. Now if this next die happens to roll an 8, guess what? You're going to get another die, and if by some miracle the dice are really favoring you, keep rolling 8s, you're going to keep grabbing more dice and continue to roll them until you get a final die result that is not an 8, and then you're going to count up how many successes you have, and you're going to compare those to your target number, and your opponent needs to do the same based on one of their skills. Whoever gets the most successes wins the test. So how does that work in the game? Well, it's pretty simple. Let's just say our U.S. military trooper who has the carbine decides that they want to shoot this Martian right here who is equipped with the disintegration ray. Without using any of the bonuses, I'll get into those in just a moment. Basically what this U.S. military trooper is going to do, he's going to roll 3 dice and he's going to compare what he rolls to a shoot statistic, and he's going to see if he manages to get any successes. Well, let's go ahead and roll the dice again here because this is a pretty poor example. I'd rather get something better to show you exactly how this works. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this carbine-equipped military U.S. soldier. He has a shoot statistic of 5, so he needs to make sure that each one of these dice rolls a 5 or higher. For each die that rolls a 5 or higher, it's going to be considered a success. Every die that's a 4 or lower is going to be considered a failure and not going to have any effect. So this example, we rolled a 6, a 7, and a 7, so basically we've gotten 3 successes. Now, of course, don't forget about those exploding dice. So if I happen to roll an 8, that'd be 3 successes, and I get 1 more die to roll to add in there, and that'd be considered a possible another success. So if I had gotten that 8, I'd have a 5, a 6, a 7, and 8, which actually be a total of 4 successes. Unfortunately, I didn't get that 8. I got a 7, so I didn't get that extra die to roll, so we're going to go ahead and pull that right back out. Now this poor helpless Martian, not really that helpless, gets to roll some dice to see if he can survive being shot at by this Marine trooper. He's also going to roll some dice and he's going to compare what he rolls to his survive statistic, and he's going to count up how many successes he has, and again, whoever gets the most successes is going to win the contest. So we simply look at the statistics from the Martian with disintegration ray, and we're going to see that he has a survive statistic of a 6, which means he needs to roll a 6 or higher to get a success. So if he rolled a 4, 5, and a 6, these 2 dice have no effect at all, and he only gets 1 success versus this U.S. military trooper armed with a carbine who happened to get 3 successes. So normally what would happen is we compare these 3 to this 1. We see that he would successfully shoot the Martian. This Martian would be defeated and he'd be removed from the game. But it gets a little more complex than that because that would make things far too simple and probably would make the game quite as fun as it can be. Some figures in the game, and we're talking about Martians with disintegration rifles in this instance, have special abilities. And for example, this guy happens to have the special ability called armor. Well, what armor does, it means that he always gets 1 success on top of whatever he happens to roll. So you can just might as well just imagine that an imaginary die happened to roll a 6, which would equal a survive stat for him. So he'd actually end up getting 2 successes because that's the special ability he gets for having that nice thick armor, which has a tendency to block bullets a little bit better than these U.S. troopers are equipped with. After you factor in any or all special abilities, you're basically just going to see which side happens to roll more successes versus the other. Whoever rolls more successes is basically going to win the contest. So in this example, our U.S. trooper with the carbine happened to get 3 successes. This Martian, with their special ability, gives him an extra success, is only get a total of 2 successes. 3 is greater than 2. He's shot, he's destroyed, and he is removed from the game. Of course, if our military trooper happened to only get 2 successes and this Martian happened to have 2 successes, he'd actually survive, but since there's some special extra rules that say if he survives due to his armor, he ends up being rattled, which means he's going to be laid down. I'll cover that in just a few minutes here, just trying to cover the basics of how the game works. And of course, if your victim gets more successes than you do, there's nothing that's going to happen. They're going to be totally unaffected, and you just wasted your shots, and that's basically the end of the activation for your model. Mars Attacks uses what is referred to as true line of sight, which basically means you're going to get down on your knees if you have to, get behind your model and look at exactly what your model can see. If your model can see it, they can shoot it. If they can see the entire figure, they're going to get a bonus. If they can't see any of the figure at all, they can't shoot it at all. So just for a good example, let's go ahead and move these dice here and get them out of the way. This soldier right here has clear line of sight to this guy, and we can see that if we got down and looked behind this guy and see exactly what he can see, we'd see that he have true clear line of sight, which means he's going to get a bonus to his dice, which means he gets to roll 4 versus rolling 3. And I'll cover that in just a few moments. But if we look at this nice group of Martians over here and we get down on our hands and knees if we need to, look from the true line of sight from the sky, we're going to see that he can see these 3 guys, at least parts of them, but he can't see this guy at all. So he could shoot all 3 of these guys and only get 3 dice. He can't shoot this guy at all, or he could shoot this guy right here who has true line of sight to and roll a total of 4 dice. At least after we figure out range and make sure that everybody's in range. And since he can shoot up to 6 squares, all these guys happen to be in range of him, but the best one to shoot in this example would be this guy who has a clear line of sight to. You can also get another bonus die if you happen to aim before you shoot. So if we were aiming at this guy, we get 5 dice. If we're aiming at these 3 guys, we get 4 dice. And of course, this guy right here, we can't shoot at all because this building right here blocks our line of sight. So to take our scenario from earlier, if this Marine with the carbine decided to shoot at this Martian standing right here, he'd get to roll 5 dice and he'd look for results. Any 8s are going to give him an additional die to roll to look for additional successes. If you get multiple 8s, you're going to get more rolls to add in. So at this point, we've rolled quite a few 8s. We've got quite a few successes here. So this is an example. We'll just re-roll the dice we knew that missed, and then we're going to add up all our successes. We have a 5, we have a 6, and we happen to have 3 8s for a total of 5 successes versus this lone Martian who's standing here. That lone Martian is going to get 3 dice to roll, and remember they need to get 5 or more successes to survive. They're going to roll their dice, and they need at least a 6 or higher. Anything lower than that's going to be missed. Any 8s get to be re-rolled. So we're going to roll. We're going to get a total of 1 success because they have a survive stat of 6. This is going to give them 1 success plus their armor stat, which gives them a free success on top of that. That's going to be 2 successes versus the 5 successes of the U.S. Trooper. Guess who wins the die? Guess who gets blown up? Guess who gets blown into little bitty pieces and gets removed from the game. Fight tests work pretty much the same way. If 2 enemies happen to be in the same square, they're going to go into hand-to-hand because you can't shoot at each other if you happen to be in the same square. And also that means that if you happen to be in a square with another Martian, nobody can shoot in this square, which means these guys can't shoot in, and these guys can't shoot in. These guys are stuck fighting hand to hand. You're simply going to roll the dice. You're going to compare any bonuses you have for extra dice if you get them, and you're going to see whoever gets the most successes. Whoever does is probably going to defeat the other guy or do something bad to him. The thing you have to be careful about with fight tests, though, is that somebody doesn't have to roll a survive test. They can actually just roll a fight back test. And whoever gets the most successes is going to defeat the other person, even if they're not the one who initiated the fight. So if this U.S. soldier happened to walk into this square right here and decide to get in a fist fight with this Martian, and the Martian decided that they're going to fight back versus just trying to survive, this Martian happened to get more successes, they're going to defeat the soldier who's going to be removed from the game. To add to the fun and the variety of the game, each player is going to get a hand of cards at the start of the game, and they always have a hand of cards, and these cards are going to give them extra special abilities such as adding +1 to one of your survive checks as a Martian, adding 1 extra die to your rolls to attack, fight, or survive versus a Martian, or sometimes you can just have support cards which are going to allow you to do freeze rays to start attacking your opponents and making their life just a little more randomly difficult. The fun thing about Mars Attacks is, though, that there's only 1 deck of cards, and the player's going to be sharing these deck of cards, which allows you to hoard cards from another player, especially if you see it's a card that you don't want them to have. And the reason why I say that is because every one of these cards is double-sided. If you're a human player, you're going to use the top half of the card. If you're an alien player, you're going to use the opposite side of the card. And each player is going to be drawing from the exact same deck of cards to add cards to their hand. And you get to decide if you want to use these cards or risk using them and allowing them to go in the discard pile, which means your opponent may eventually get those cards into their hand and make your life just a little bit more difficult. These cards can also add a little bit of randomness to the game by random events that may pop up occasionally, such as some flaming cows running through the battlefield, and they really don't care who they set on fire because if you're a cow and you're on fire, you're a little bit upset and you really don't care who you burn down at that point. Those are pretty much the core mechanics of Mars Attacks. Everything's going to be resolved by the roll of the dice, or things being modified by cards being played by either player to either make the battlefield a little more dangerous, to add to your rolls, to give you extra dice to roll, to change things up, or even send a freeze ray at one of your opponents, especially if they happen to have somebody with a submachine gun, making your life a little bit more difficult. Players are going to keep taking turns until they get the certain amount of victory points they need, whether they get victory points simply by defeating opponents, or they get victory points by finding Martian technology, or if you're a Martian, you're trying to find cows that you can kind of take into your spaceship and do a little bit of strange operations on. Later scenarios even give you victory points for things such as rescuing certain heroes, and basically heroes in this game are named characters. There's only one of them allowed on the board. Some of them are like Eva, who is the police officer, or like General Tor, who is the leader of the Martians. These unique heroes also have heroic points, which are going to give them extra special abilities that they can use, but they have to be very careful because each hero has a certain amount of heroic points. And once you've used up all your hero points, they're all gone. You can't use them anymore to do things like save your bacon, use some of your special abilities, or even take some extra turns with that specific hero. What makes these heroes so much better than the general run-of-the-mill grunts is the simple fact that these heroes do have these heroic points, which are going to allow them to actually basically have extra hit points. But it's kind of a balancing act because you can use these heroic points to either give you a freebie if you happen to get shot and fail. It's going to give you a freebie. You can spend it to say that I didn't get killed by that shot and nothing bad is going to happen to you. You can also use your heroic points to do extra movement, or you can use your heroic points to do extra special abilities that happen to be unique to your special hero. Unfortunately though, you're not going to get a hero in every single one of these missions, but for the missions that do bring the heroes in, they do add a lot of fun and a lot of variety to the basic game. Now that you understand how to do things in Mars Attacks, now I need to explain to you exactly what you're supposed to do when you play the game. Every scenario is going to decide which team is going to go first, whether it happens to be the human team happens to go first, such as in this very first scenario, or if it happens to be the Martians who get to go first, such as other scenarios may have happened. On a player's turn, a player can do a couple different things and they have to be done kind of in a set specific order. The first thing you can do is you can decide to activate one of your units and either activate them in a special way, or you can decide to do nothing with that model. Now you can activate up to 2 models on your turn, one at a time. You have to complete the movement or the actions with that specific model before you decide to move or activate a second model. If you don't want to do that, what you can decide to do is you can play a card, but if you decide to play a card, you're only allowed to activate 1 model on your turn. And basically what you do is you're going to activate your model, do whatever you want to do with that model, and then you can go ahead and play a card. Now here's the trick, and this is a mistake that a lot of people mistake when they're first learning how to play Mars Attacks. If you happen to play a card which is going to give you a bonus to one of your special abilities, for example, let's say if we have our submachine gun here, we're going to shoot one of these Martians, and we decide to play a card which is going to modify our roll, that counts as moving a unit and playing a card for that turn. Even though we use this card to modify this model's action specifically, it still counts as moving a model and playing a card, so we can't move any models for the rest of that turn. And that does mean if I move this model and do things with him and decide to move this model and do things with him, I can't play any cards on this guy because it's either activate 2 models or activate 1 card or 1 model plus play a card. Can't activate 2 models and activate the second guy with a card. It's 2 models or 1 model plus a card only. When a player activates one of their models, there's a couple different actions they can do with one of their models. They can move 1 square, or they can stay within the same square and just move within the same square they're currently in. Now why would you want to do that? Well, let's say this Martian happens to be right here, and put some nice plain line of sight of this guy with that nice big machine gun, and we really don't want our poor Martian to be blown apart because we're the Martian player. Well, we can decide to move within the same square, which takes us out of his line of sight and makes us safe, at least for the time being. A model can also do 2 moves if they like, which is going to allow them to move up to 2 squares. So one of these military guys can move 1 and then 2 squares. And of course, we can position ourselves anywhere within the square we land in if we're hoping it's going to block a little bit of line of sight, make it a little more difficult for our opponents to shoot us. Alternate, what we can do is we can decide to move 1 square and we can shoot, or we can hold still and aim, which is going to give us an extra 1 die to roll when we take our shoot test versus one of our targets. You can also reverse some of these actions if you like. For example, this Martian happened to start their turn right there. We can go ahead and take a shot and then decide to move after we take our shot at our opponent. We can also decide if we're knocked down, we can decide to stand up. And of course, we have 2 actions, so you can stand up and shoot if you like. Or you can stand up and move only 1 square, because standing up does happen to be one of our 2 actions we can take with our unit for that turn. The only thing you do have to be careful about when you're taking your turn is that if you happen to move into a square with an enemy, you have to stop your movement immediately, even if you have movement points left over, because remember, everybody gets 2 movement points. If you have to move into a square with an opponent, you have to stop immediately and immediately have to fight one of the targets in the square that you moved into. Now, there's some special abilities such as Brave, which can prevent you from picking your target. But generally, if your opponent doesn't have any special abilities making it more difficult for you, when you move in the square, you can decide exactly who you're going to fight with. Also, if you happen to be knocked over and you decide to stand up in a square with an opponent, you have to fight immediately. You can't decide to stand up and move out. If you're in a square with opponents, you're stuck there till one of you is no longer standing, and then once everybody else is either knocked over because you defeated them all, or because they've been rattled or something else has happened, then you can finally move out of that square. After a player has taken their 2 actions, whether they've taken 2 actions by activating 2 units or their actions were to activate 1 unit and to play a card, their turn is over and the other player gets to start moving some of their units and doing the same things you basically got to do. They get to activate up to 2 models or activate 1 model and play a card and do the same actions that you're allowed to do with your own units also. Eventually it's going to get to the point where one player has activated all their models and they can't do anything on their turn anymore. And when that happens, that means that the only thing they can do is play cards on their turn. And if that happens to be to the point where they don't have any cards in their hand and they've activated all their models, the only thing they can do is pass. Once both players have passed, the turn is over. Once both players are finished activating all their models, there's no more models they can activate, and there's no more cards they can play. They basically have the options of either, if they have any cards left in the hand, they can discard any cards in their hand they don't want anymore, or they can keep what they got and draw back up to 4 cards. Then everybody's going to remove their activation tokens, And then the player who finished, and this is the key thing, the player who finished activating their models first is the player who gets to go first on the next turn. That's how the rest of the game is going to play out until one player happens to get 8 victory points, winning the game. There's just a couple things left to cover, and then you understand all the basics for playing Mars Attacks. Next thing to cover is movement. Now, movement is pretty darn easy in Mars Attacks. Basically, any diagonal movement is allowed. So, for example, this guy can move from here to this square right here, which would have been a diagonal movement because they're in this square. They can move here as their movement. A player can also move straight or move orthogonal. Additionally, a soldier or any unit specifically, doesn't really matter, can also move over a wall just as long as their model happens to be taller than that wall. So this guy could move over this wall with no problems. He could also move over this wall with no problems, even though it blocks the complete line there. It just simply is assumed that he lunges through a window or does something heroic. But if he ever comes upon a wall that happens to be taller than him, he can't actually get over that wall, and he needs to go around by moving diagonals and then moving across to get to his target if that's how he wants to move. Now, I don't want to go over every single special ability that every single model could have because there's approximately, I think, 20, if not more, special abilities. Actually, I know there's more if you start throwing in some of the expansions. So it'll probably take way too long and probably bore you to tears for me to go over every single special ability. Just suffice it to say, most of the special abilities are explained pretty darn well in the book. They basically do things like give you extra fight dice, extra shoot dice, make you harder to kill, make you a little bit tougher, allow you to tell other units to act in your place, and do various things that kind of break the rules for the game and make the game a little bit less simplistic. What I do want to do is take a few moments to start explaining exactly how these cards work because they add the most variety to the game. In Mars Attacks, each player is going to be sharing the same deck of cards, and you can only use one half of the card depending on which side you're playing. If you happen to be the Earthlings or the Defenders, you can only use the blue side, and if you happen to be the Martian player, you're only allowed to use the red side of each one of these cards. Additionally, each one of these cards has some symbols on it telling you exactly when you can use these cards. If you ever have a card that has a star symbol on it, that means you can only play that card on your turn. Now remember how this is work. You're going to take one action with one of your figures, then you can go ahead and play the card. Or you can take two actions with two different, or you're going to take actions with two different figures, which means you're not allowed to play a card on that turn. So remember, action and then card, or two actions and no card play. Very specific to make that distinction. And you can only play a card with a star symbol on your turn. Any card that happens to have this alien face, and don't get confused, just because it's an alien face doesn't mean human players can't use it. The alien face just means that you can use it on your turn, or you can use it on an opponent's turn. That's the difference. Star means your turn only. Alien face means you can play that card anytime you like. The red side is for the Martians. The blue side is for the Defenders or the humans. Now, most cards in the game are pretty simplistic. Understand you're basically going to read the text and do exactly what the card tells you to do, and you're going to discard the card after it's been used. The difference are the support cards, which are going to do some slightly different things, and you're going to play these just a little bit differently. Now, the way a support card works is if you decide to play a support card, you're simply going to play it by laying it down in front of you, and that's all you're going to do. Now, the strength of the support card is going to be based on how many more support cards you happen to play in front of yourself, which happen to have the same effect. So if we only have one support card for Heat Ray in play, it's going to do a 2 dice attack for us. If we happen to get 2 of these support cards in play and then discard both of them to use them, we're going to get a 4 dice attack just by following the directions on the card. And if we get 3 of these cards into play, we're going to get a 6 dice attack that we can use, which will cause us to discard all 3 of these cards because we burn all 3 of them to use that special ability. And of course, the Defenders aren't going to be left out. They're going to get their own support cards too. They have their own special abilities, so don't feel like the Martian player is getting a little bit of an advantage over you. But you do have to be careful with these support cards because there are cards that you can play that are going to allow you to discard support cards played by your opponent. So it does become a little bit of a gamble. Do you want to try to get all 3 of those support cards out there for the most powerful attack? Or do you want to risk a smaller attack and make sure that your opponent doesn't get a card out there that's going to make your support attack weaker and lose effect? The final type of cards are the event cards, and the event cards are the little bit more unique thing about the game. They're going to add a little bit of variety and add a little bit of chaos, which really fits in with the theme of Mars Attacks. Every time a player needs to refill their hand, they're simply going to draw cards one at a time. Of course, you're not going to show your opponents what cards you're drawing, but you're going to fill up your hand. And if you manage to fill up your hand, back up to 4 with no events happening, you're perfectly fine. But if one of the cards you draw happens to be an event, you're going to resolve that event immediately, do exactly what the text of the card says, and carry out that event. And then the event is going to be discarded if that happens to be the case for that event, and you're going to fill up your hand completely. The trick is here, if you have to be very, very careful, because you can keep drawing events, If the cards happen to be against you, and if you keep drawing events, you keep drawing those cards until your hand either gets up to 4 cards, or those events just make your life so miserable and somebody loses the game. Of course, that's probably not going to happen, but it would be pretty funny if it did. There's just a couple more quick fine points to explain to you on Mars Attacks, and I can clean everything up and set this up and show you exactly what this game looks like when it's played. The first thing that I want to cover before I forget is the fact that each one of these squares has a maximum size of 6. And whether it happens to be one of your guys plus 5 of the enemies, or for any variety of that, count it up, it just cannot have more than 6 models in a single square. If you ever see a square that currently has 6 models already in it, then nobody else is allowed to move into it. Whether it's an enemy or if it happens to be an ally model, the max amount of models in one square is 6. Combination of 3 for each side, or a total of 6, or however it may be, no more than 6 per square. The next thing that's very important to understand is this game operates on the Emperor's New Groove no touchy rule, which means that no player can ever move one of your models for you. So if your player model ever gets knocked over for any reason, you get to decide where in the square he gets knocked over. When your model gets to stand up for any reason, only you get to decide where in the square your model gets to stand up. It's the no touchy rule from Emperor's New Groove. Don't ever forget it. The final thing to cover is the rattled rule, and the rattled rule is what's going to stop you from ever putting all your guys in one single square, or as they say, don't put all your chickens in one basket because you're not going to like the results. And for a second, let's just pretend I said don't put all your eggs in one basket, because what I wanted to say is don't put all your eggs in one basket because your guy's going to get a little chicken and you're not going to like the results. And what I mean by that is anytime an enemy shoots one of your guys and happens to defeat one of your figures, all the rest of your survivors in the same square need to roll to see if they become rattled. Now, if they become rattled, that means they're going to be laid face down. And remember, you place them face down, not your opponent, so you get to decide where in the square they're going to land. And once a unit is rattled, the only thing they can do on their turn when it comes back to move them is stand up and then perform one action. Whether that action happens to be moving into another square, or the action happens to be standing up and shooting at an opponent, whatever it may be, the only thing you can do is stand up and then do one single action. And to see if one of your models happens to be rattled, what you're going to do is you're going to roll an 8-sided die for every single model that happens to be in that square, and you're going to roll it for each. You're not going to take the result for everybody. You're going to roll it. You're going to pick one of your models and say, I'm rolling for this guy first right here. If I roll a 5 through an 8, he is not rattled, and he gets to stay up. If I happen to roll a 1 through a 4, the target is going to be target model is going to be rattled, and it has to be laid down in the square he currently occupies. That's pretty much everything there is to know about Mars Attacks. Of course, there's some little minor rules, but most of them are based on the scenario you happen to be playing, and I don't want to go through and make this video any more complex than it needs to be, because quite honestly, Mars Attacks is a pretty simple game. It's just basically rolling the dice. Last man standing, or the first one to reach a victory point total, is going to be the winner. That's a brief overview of how to play Mars Attacks. Stay tuned. I'm going to set everything up for video number 2, where I'm going to show you a sample gameplay of Mars Attacks using the very first scenario. The invaders arrive.